All right. We're almost near the end, yeah. I see some of you are starting to glaze over. You need some caffeine. So I'll try to make this quick. Now, mind you, the opinions about to be expressed are not that of the CBOQ. Let's put that disclaimer on right now. But rather, I guess part of it is that as we begin to, and really one of the things that we want, that I hopefully you can take away from our time together is not necessarily that out of all these talks that came out, you have to somehow use all of them. But rather, it's at least seeing what's one or two things that as we're looking at all these different angles that seem to resonate with you. And I would encourage you, if you want, go pick that person's brain. If Eric said something that seemed to resonate well, go pick his brain. That's what he's there for. There you go. So, so I encourage you, as we head to this one final part, and we haven't talked about the coaching thing yet. We'll do that in a few minutes. But part of it is this, right? Is as we're looking at what exactly does youth ministry look like in 10 years? Because part of the problem is sometimes when we don't exactly know where things might be headed, we don't know how to prepare for it. Right now, one of the big things that people talk about over and over again, right, especially the last couple of years, is this whole idea of intergenerational, right? This whole idea of, whether you want to call it family ministry, you want to call it something else, intergenerational is this kind of big buzzword now. And I've dealt with a lot of different youth ministries through the CBOQ, and this is one question that seems to come up a lot sometimes. How do I have parents support the youth ministry? Right? I tried to organize a parents' night, and 3 of them came up, right, kind of thing. Right? And usually this question comes up, how do we get parents supporting the youth ministry? And I wonder if that question itself, though, maybe has the wrong paradigm in mind. Because first of all, you got to start off with what exactly is the purpose of a youth ministry, all right? And again, this is what I'm suggesting it is. Whether you agree with it or not, we can talk after. But this is what I'm going to suggest what it is. It's essentially supporting parents as they fulfill their God-given responsibilities of raising their kids. Now, I know that there are sometimes different exceptions to this, right? So whether the parents are Christians or not, that's something that plays into this. Whether the parents are even in the picture or not, again, that's part that can play into this. But if you want to get to the very generic definition of youth ministry, I would suggest this is what it is. It's somehow the youth ministry is there now to support parents as they raise their kids. The problem, though, sometimes is that, yes, we say that as youth pastors, but then at what point do we advocate for them? Because I think this is one of the key things that sometimes we tend to miss, right? Is the fact is, what does it mean to make room for parents? What does it actually mean? If we are serious, now that let's say if your youth group has 10 kids, right, and 8 of those parents are in your congregation, what does it mean now for you to come alongside them and say, how can I make space for you to raise your kids? Because let's face it, if you ask them, I'm going to guess they're saying, I'm working 55, 60 hours a week. Okay, both of us are working. We're out of the house from 8 a.m. till 6 p.m. By the time we get back, I might wolf down dinner before I take my kids to swimming, ballet, piano, hockey, whatever you want to call it, right? And then weekends is even worse because now I got tournaments, recitals, plus you got church, plus I got to prepare as a Sunday school teacher, plus I got to do this and that. And you start adding all that up, and for us to go alongside them and say, you've got to make room for your kids, well, how do we, though, as youth pastors, begin to make room for them? How do we actually go before, let's say, our church board, our CE board, whoever it is, and begin to advocate on behalf of our parents, to say to them, listen, if we're serious about wanting our parents to spend time with their kids, how do we actually begin to pull things back for them in order to make that happen? So now we're not asking Mrs. Jones to do Sunday school, to be on the board, to also run on a hospitality committee and all this other stuff. What can we as a church make room for her in order to make that happen? Now this is going to cause problems, right? Because part of it is that if we're talking about these kind of intergenerational structures, this way of now having the church not necessarily become these silos that we sometimes look at, but becomes almost more blended, something is going to shift here. And this is what I'm going to suggest. This is the premise that I'm going to base this off of. Is that if we actually believe in this idea of gift-based ministry, that's not just the church is in a certain template, you've got to fulfill that template. If we actually believe that Kipling Avenue Baptist, that First Baptist Church, all these little outposts that God has put in these various communities. If we actually believe that God has gifted that group of people with the specific resources needed to do their specific job in a specific time, then obviously that means things have to shift. The way things happened 30 years ago, 20 years ago, even 10 years ago, may not necessarily work anymore. And so, if that's the case, then what needs to change? If that's the case, if we believe that what God has put you in, the situation, the context, with a specific vision, a specific purpose, a specific mission, the strategy then has to form around what exactly are the resources you have to make it happen. Now again, God may expand that at times. God may contract that at times. But if this is the case, and if we believe that somehow this intergenerational thing is supposed to work, right? And when we talk about mentoring, when we talk about making room for people to be mentors, we make room for parents to actually raise their kids, to spend time, to get to engage with them, and have other adults engage with them, well then somehow then, something's got to change. Something's got to shift. And so in 10 years, what does that mean? This is what I'm going to suggest. In 10 years, I think the church structure is going to be much more fluid than it is now. Now, it doesn't mean that there's no structure. I'm not suggesting all of a sudden, I know some people, when they think of this, they almost think it's like, we're back to the 60s, a bunch of hippies smoking around. It's all good, whatever you want to do, kind of thing. No, I'm not suggesting that, but rather we begin to regularly, whether that's every year, every 2 years, every 3 years, we begin to evaluate as a local church community to discern what is God doing. And we change what we're doing based on what He's challenging us to move ahead with. What that also means is that this idea of youth pastor now, 20 years ago, youth pastor might have been, here's your 10 kids, here's your 20 kids, go disciple them, have fun. We'll see you in 4 years, right? Has now shifted from that to, especially if intergenerational is what we're talking about, this person who's on your church staff no longer is just responsible for the youth, but rather this person now becomes, in a sense, a youth specialist on your team, right? Just like if you think about if you have cancer or something, right? You usually have a team of doctors that look after you, right? It's not just one person. There's a team of people who look after you because each of them specialize in a certain area to contribute their expertise into that area. And so the youth pastor, youth worker, whatever you want to call them, that professional person no longer is just looking after those 20 kids. And I would suggest it's not even now how do you relate to parents and everything else. It's now as a team of people, that one of their things that they do is that they help to bring the youth culture perspective into that. So as we're shifting down this direction, here's what this means to engage with people in this demographic. And how do we now as a church begin to address these in these different areas? So it's no longer just segmented, it now becomes this blend, but it's a blend with a certain specialization in that. And the last thing here, and I wonder if this is happening, if this is something that's going to become almost like a breaking point in our society. Is I'm going to guess, if I polled all of you right now, how much of you are actually getting the amount of sleep you need to get? I'm going to guess most of you are going to say no, right? I know I'm not right now, right? And so at some point, when you're asking your parents, when you're asking people in your church, chances are they're all saying, I'm busy doing this, I'm doing that, I gotta work, I gotta do this and that. And yet, at what point though, do we have to begin to repace ourselves? At what point does society begin to say, you know what, enough's enough? And some people are already starting to do that, right? Some people are already starting to pull back. In my generation, that sounds so weird, but in my generation, right, like we were involved, in at least 3 different extracurricular activities one time. Me and my sister, that's 6 things in a week that our family's involved in, right? And right now, my wife and I are saying to our kids, you know what, you can choose one thing you're involved in every semester. That's it. I'm not shipping you 8 different things. I'm not going to ship you to Chinese school and ballet and piano and all this stuff. You choose one thing you want to do each term, we'll do it. That's it. Because we recognize in our lives we got to repace things, or else we're going to burn out fast. Well, what happened though with the church in 10 years, as we begin to reshift, as we begin to see what God has already been leading to, And if we're going to have this kind of blending, this change of how ministries now relate to each other, how they begin to interact with each other, well, it becomes much more organic in that sense. That perhaps the church then becomes the leader in helping society to repace itself. What would that look like in 10 years? What would it look like if you went around people, and I know that, I think Tim was alluding to this earlier, right? Right? When someone comes up to you, usually you ask them, how are you? I'm busy, right? What if you began to look at people and say, hey, Jeff, how you doing? He responded back, I'm actually doing okay right now. I'm actually going at an okay pace, right? Obviously, there are seasons. There are times when things are going to go really, really brutal, but there are also times when things get slowed down. One person challenged me with this. He said that, if you think in the financial world, when we talk about financial planning, they say usually set aside 10 to 15% of your income, right, for a rainy day, right, for the crisis, whenever it happens. I can't say I follow that well. But what happens if you did that emotionally? What if you were actually able to find yourself operating at 85% emotionally, so that when the crisis comes, and let's face it, in ministry, there's a lot of times when a crisis will come. What if you were able to establish a pattern where you were spending 85% of your energy, so that when the crisis comes, you actually have something to bank on? What would happen for a church to look like that? To say, we're not going to try to run 50,000 different ministries to try to reach 10 people. But rather, we're actually going to reorganize and reintegrate in such a way then that's no longer just, one church I know, they do a line dancing ministry, they do a badminton thing, they do all these different things. At some point, yes, we may have the people who do that now, but at some point it's going to break down. So, at what point, though, in 10 years, what will it look like for us? If we're serious about this intergenerational thing, if we're serious about, as Ryan was alluding to, this whole idea with Chuck Park, saying, what happens if we have five adults investing in one student? If we're serious about that kind of stuff, then we've got to be prepared as youth leaders to be advocates of that with our church boards, with our leadership, with our pastors, and to be champions for our parents so that they can carry out that God-given responsibility. As if we're not willing to do that, what makes you think that other people are going to support you in what you do? Seriously. It's not going to happen. But it's going to take some work. It's going to ruffle some feathers. I think, as Reba said, it's going to be like kicking some boxes down. Right? Because it will happen. But I think it has to happen. I think God's already doing it. The question is, are we going to be in on that ride anyway? So I'm curious, over the next few minutes, let's make it 5 minutes. So get back in your grooves, all right? For the next 5 minutes, what are some ways that you think, or what are some ways that you could be advocating for your parents or for this intergenerational model? All right? Go.